Good evening. Welcome to my Thursday night Bible study. I'm Henry Neufeld of Energion Publications, and we're looking at eschatology. Let's go to the Lord in prayer. Lord, I thank you for bringing us together this evening. I thank you for each person who will listen or watch this in the future. Pray that you will send your Holy Spirit to help us to hear your voice and to find the message that you have for us. In the name of Jesus. Amen. Well, it's been 2 weeks that I've missed. The first, I was at the Academy of Parish Clergy conference, which is just north of Orlando. The Academy of Parish Clergy is an interesting group to get together with. Most of the folks have doctoral degrees in various subjects related to their ministry. And that was a very enjoyable time selling books. And then the next week, just because I was not quite up to it. So tonight, we're going to be continuing the look at Daniel, and in particular, we start at Daniel 6. We're going to work from Daniel 6 into Daniel 7. Now, I wanted to bring us a review just a little bit in order to look at the landscape. We started out with the study guide to Eschatology written by Dr. Edward Vick, Eschatology, a Participatory Study Guide. And this book, the purpose of this book was to lay out the landscape. One of the questions that's addressed, for example, is what is a Christian eschatology? What is it that makes your doctrine of eschatology Christian? Is it some particular set of beliefs that you have about end times? Or what else that may be. And of course, we're still in some of the Old Testament passages, but we're coming up on ones where some of the issues are, where do these prophecies lead to? What is the end? Or where would the fulfillment be? And especially when we go from Daniel 7 to Daniel 8 and then into Daniel 9, we have some of the prophecies that are used as messianic, prophecies that are used with reference to the coming of Jesus. In our showcase today, I've enabled a link to Dr. Vick's study guide to eschatology, because what that book does is provide us with a kind of a roadmap, the terminology. How do systematic theologians especially discuss eschatology? And one of the most important things that you'll find from that book is that there are a lot more ideas about how eschatology is to be understood, especially how some of the biblical prophecies are to be understood, than you might have imagined. A lot of people teach this material with the idea that they have found the key and that they have the final answer. And there's a great deal of uncertainty. There's a great deal of controversy about many of these things. And one of the reasons I'm doing this study is I think you owe it to yourself to spend the time to find out some of the alternatives, find out what the options are, before settling on some particular point, especially those of us who work and teach in mainline denominations, I think have fallen down on the job and left it to the televangelists with large prophecy charts to explain especially the symbolic visions, Revelation in particular. And by not talking about this, we leave its interpretation to those who very often get well off of the track or simply don't have a how shall I say, they're not trying to teach the range or the perspectives or an understanding of the passages, but rather they're trying to present their particular end times chart. And so I think it's very important for us to look at it. Having said that, let's get back into the book of Daniel. Now, I need to remind us of a couple of things as we go to chapter 6 and from chapter 6 into chapter 7. Daniel, first of all, was written in two languages, Hebrew and Aramaic. The first chapter and the second chapter through the middle of the fourth verse are in Hebrew. At the middle of the fourth verse, when it is said that somebody is speaking in Aramaic, the text itself changes to Aramaic. That Aramaic portion continues through the end of chapter 7. That is, through the end of the material that we're going to be studying today. And at the end of chapter 7, we go back into Hebrew. Now, there are a lot of explanations for why this happened, and some of them are fairly creative. I find none of them convincing enough to make me certain that I'd want to give this as an answer, but the difference in the language does tend to get in the way of some of the favorite theories of how things go together. For example, one way of dividing the book is into Daniel 1 through 6, which is stories and history, and 7 through 12, which is prophecy, prediction, visions. Unfortunately for that division of the book, we do have the language division doesn't match it, but also we have visions such as chapter 2 in the portion, or in that case, a dream in the first 6 chapters. And so that division is not entirely accurate. Not entirely a clean transfer. The problem, I believe, and this goes down to the foundation of how we interpret apocalyptic literature, is that we are reading the material while asking the wrong questions. If you come to some piece of literature assuming that it must answer a particular question, you can often read it in such a way to force an answer to that question. Now, how accurate that answer will be is really rather random, because if the answer is not the intended result, it doesn't matter how reliable or unreliable the author was. It doesn't matter how reliable or unreliable the transmission of the text was. If you're forcing it to answer a question that none of those people intended it to answer, it may come back. You'll probably come back with an incorrect result. And so when we approach Daniel with that division, is it stories here and then visions over here? Just what exactly how is it divided up? That usually means that we're asking the wrong question. For example, when I took a class in Daniel in college, the emphasis was, let's get to chapter 7. We'll spend a little time on chapter 2 because we have the image and the succession of kingdoms, and we can chart that out and make nice big pictures of the image, and that's great. Then let's get to chapter 7, where we have all of the really creative beasts, and they're coming in succession out of the water, and isn't that great? And now again, we're dealing with what's really interesting, which is a prediction of what's going to happen. But in reading that, it's very easy to miss the overall picture that is being presented, and the overall picture is more what the author is interested in, and that fits together. Apocalyptic literature, as I mentioned before, is crisis literature, which is, it's written at a time of great difficulty, and it is more in the way of an exhortation as to how people are supposed to behave than it is as a specific prediction of what exactly is going to happen. In the case of Daniel, your crisis that is presented in the story. Now remember, we have the two dating options. Is it in the 6th century, in which case we're talking about occurring between the accession of King Nebuchadnezzar, 605 BC, uh, and extending down into somewhere in the 530s, just a bit after 538, which would be when Daniel would pass from the scene. That's the first dating, and that's where the story is set. The second dating comes from the time of the Maccabees. Let's look at the first dating here for a second first. If we're working with that dating in the 6th century, or the very end of the 7th century, 605, if that's what we're dealing with, then Judah is about to fall. It in fact does fall in 586. And at that point, Judah essentially goes into exile. Now we know that there are a few people hanging around or living in Judah, although many of those, according to Jeremiah, end up down in Babylon. Your crisis here is the destruction of the temple. People are taken into exile. Is this the end of Judah? One of the key elements then in response to the crisis is, how do we keep our identity while we're living in exile in a foreign land? And so you see your series of stories that come out as in talking about faithfulness and looking at how am I going to be who I am while I'm living in a place where my faith, my nation, is not recognized. Where, as a matter of fact, the conqueror would be very delighted to see that identity essentially wiped out. So the key there is maintaining oneself as a Jew in the court of Babylon. Daniel is called upon first to stand up for his dietary restrictions. Now, as Christians, we find that a fairly odd sort of thing to take a stand on. But again, that is the key element of saying, here's how I say I am loyal to God. It is the key element of identity that's coming out. So Daniel stands out. God blesses him. Then as we go through the story, chapter 2 is the dream and interpretation, but chapter 3 again puts the 3 Hebrew children into this position. See, so you have the crisis of the loss of your nationality, and now here you are standing up. The 3 Hebrews stand in the group where the entire crowd is bowing down, and so they maintain their identity as opposed to the power of Babylon. It doesn't sound as shocking to us as it would in its own time, when the expectation was the other guy conquers you, their king, their God is greater than yours. Go ahead and worship their gods, or at least add them in. And so in these polytheistic countries, it was quite an easy sort of a response. Let's add, we just go ahead and add some worship of your gods. The Jews were considered quite perverse for not being willing to go along with this. But that's what this is about, because here you have this question is, are we going to maintain our identity? And in connection with that, of course, is it worth it? Is God eventually going to win in this situation? Is God, in fact, the sovereign? And so as you go into Daniel chapter 2, and you have the image, you're saying to Nebuchadnezzar, you are the head of gold. And then you come down and the descending value of the metals. But even though Nebuchadnezzar might be flattered by the fact that he is represented by the gold, he is not going to be flattered by the fact that the presentation says, you aren't going to stay in charge. God is the one who decides. And so you have then the conflict, Daniel 2 and Daniel 3. The conflict there is between a succession of empires ended by God. That's the stone cut out without hands, strikes the base of the image and destroys it. God is in control and brings history to a conclusion in chapter 2. Chapter 3, the whole image is of gold and is of course supposed to continue to stand, and everybody must worship it. So this is the challenge. Then you get into Daniel chapter 4. Nebuchadnezzar again says, I'm the one in charge. Isn't this great Babylon that I have built? And by the end of the story, again, was the Lord God reigns in the kingdoms of men and sets up over them whosoever he will. And so chapter 4 is then ended with Nebuchadnezzar saying, yay, God is in charge, I admit it. But then, of course, we see the rebellion in chapter 5 as Belshazzar holds his feast, is drinking out of the wine cups that had been taken from Jerusalem. So you can see a succession here. And I'm sorry, my throat is a bit dry, so I will be drinking a few times as we go through here. Of the rebellion, followed by the confession, and so there's a confession by Nebuchadnezzar, then followed by the successive rebellions. One of the key stories that is being told here is that even though the rulers change, history goes forward, rulers change, nations change, but the people of the world in general are not the ones who fulfill finally the will of God. They don't stick with it. Nebuchadnezzar turns to God, but he doesn't stick with it. And so you're seeing this contrast, the faithfulness of Daniel versus the unfaithfulness of Nebuchadnezzar and the other kings. We're seeing here in the form of a story the very same message that is also being presented in the form of the visions and in support of the details, where you have the symbolic prophecies being interpreted and presented and interpreted, which is an interesting characteristic of Daniel, where you have the vision and then looking for the interpretation, and then you get the interpretation of the vision down the way. Not all apocalyptic prophecy goes that way. Now, I want to bring in another point here as we're going forward, because it applies again to both the stories and to the way that we will interpret the passages, and that is the understanding of time. I was reading, we're about to release the book, and I'm going to bring it up in my showcase right now, so if you want to link to it, Meditations on the Letters of Paul by Dr. Harold Weiss. I will be interviewing Dr. Weiss. That will be either this coming Thursday or a week from this coming Thursday. I don't have the final date set on that, on the apocalyptic or eschatology of Paul as we release his new book. Now, I was reading in there's a rather important point there about time. The first line about time, and I'm just doing, is cyclical. That is, we go year in, year out, the same sort of cycle, and your rituals of worship, usually whatever religion they are cyclical in nature as well. So you have renewal, you have death, you have seed, you have harvest, but things happen in a continuing cycle. So that's one view of time. Dr. Weiss points out that the prophets see time not as a cycle, but they look as time as heading into an indefinite future, looking toward the horizon without some sort of an end point. So it becomes this process of following the commands of God. So you're advocated, and it's an exhortation to the people to follow and to keep moving forward constantly. Apocalyptic, Dr. Weiss points out, and there is a good way to look this, brings back the cycle, except it brings it back as the whole of history is one single cycle where you come back to the creation. So you go creation to recreation. Even the canonical layout of the Bible can look that way, because you have Genesis 1, where God creates, all the way through Revelation 21 and 22, where God recreates. And we have this this big cycle. So from prophetic literature, apocalyptic takes a direct arrow. Time is moving to a particular point. And that is where it is going to be. To culminate. Although in the prophetic line, we don't actually state a culmination. Apocalyptic literature says that turns this back inward. In the case of Paul, for example, he sees the end as being the death and resurrection of Jesus, that this takes history out of the result of the fall of Genesis 3, as interpreted. Again, that's a largely apocalyptic interpretation, takes it out of that and brings it back to Jesus, recreates essentially, and changes the way that we can live. Now I'm going to ask Dr. Weiss some more questions, because there's a great deal more to go. What I'm interested in here is these views of time. Now, as you watch the story here is talking about the way time goes. We start with the disaster, and we're going through this essential time of trouble. Now, common element of apocalyptic, and it is presented as much in the stories as in the prophetic imagery of Daniel, is that time culminates in a time of tribulation, a time of great trouble. And Daniel comes into that time of tribulation. In that time of tribulation, there is a constant question, which is, where is God? What is God going to do about this? And so in the book of Daniel, the presentation has it that repeatedly the people who are living through the time of trouble must stand up for God, and that God vindicates them as they go through this time of trouble. So you have these capsules as you go through these chapters talking about what's going on. And so we've seen those all the way through Daniel chapter 5. Daniel is always above it all because he is the one who is listening to God. He is the one who is hearing from God as he proceeds through his time of trouble. Those who are not constantly hearing from God have quite a lot of trouble, a variation, dips, valleys, whatever in their life, as especially they keep trying to get away from what is the rock bottom fact, according to the author of Daniel, which is that God is in fact in control. Now, before I turn here to Daniel 6, chapter 1, I did mention the 2nd century dating. Whether Daniel was written in the 6th century or the 2nd century, it fits very well in both, because in the 2nd century, heading down into the 160s BC, so we're talking somewhere in the neighborhood of 425, 430 years in difference there in the dating. But at the same time, here we have the Jews are at home, but instead of being taken exile into Babylon and called upon to leave their faith, they are engulfed in the Hellenization policies of the Seleucid Empire, and particularly when Antiochus IV arises and he's trying to conquer or trying to bring Judea culturally under the control. They have been given their religious freedom. They've been able to carry on their temple practices, but he is destroying the copies of the Torah. He is desecrating the temple and so on all through that time. And the question again comes up is the same one. Here we are in this time of trouble. Who is actually in control? What do we do? And the answer again would, if you read that in the books of Maccabees, first and second Maccabees. First Maccabees is a little bit more historical sounding. Second Maccabees is a little more about signs and wonders and exciting things. But they're both telling the story of the Jews standing up to Antiochus and eventually being vindicated by God in what they're doing. So you have a story here that fits at either time. One of the great benefits, by the way, of talking in terms of story is that it's a more flexible way of holding this conversation. And before we get out of discussing eschatology, but not tonight, we'll want to talk a little bit about, when does it really end? Can we know? Can we have any idea? When do we quit seeing these times of crisis in which, we finally come out of the other end? Especially the two-date issue here in Daniel tends to bring that up, but also the repeated nature of the problem. It's in chapters 1 and 3 and to a certain, and then 6 to a certain extent in 5, but really in 6, 1, 3, and 6, you have this vindication of the righteous person under the circumstances of persecution. And notice that the vindication is repeated. And this is in the story, this is an intentional comment, intentional exhortation. It's telling us, here's how we can, here's how this sort of thing happens. There is not a single moment at which you can say the whole crisis is done here. This sort of thing keeps coming at you and coming at you and coming at you. And so we're going to turn to chapter 6 and see it coming at Daniel again. By the way, I am checking the Q&A app from time to time. See, looking here. As we go in, I've just been talking about the dating of Daniel. I am activating in the showcase the link to my resources for dating of Daniel page, which has some information on these dating issues. My argument here is that to a great extent, the message of Daniel can be read without such a great deal of concern about the precise of which of these dates. This is not a case of the precise dating. There's a huge difference between the dates, but there's not a huge difference between the message. That does assume, by the way, that the main message is not a chart or a set of pictures of a particular set of incidents that will happen at the end. That is what most interpreters go to apocalyptic literature for. They go there to chart the end times, and that's where I think that we miss the apocalyptic literature. We keep asking, why isn't it more clear? Why can't we nail down precisely what it hooks up with? And the problem is that we're looking for the answer to the wrong question. Therefore, that answer, the answer to the question we're asking never becomes clear, because that's not what the writer is writing about. This is exhortation. This apocalyptic literature has the message that says, and we're going to see this again a number of times, that yes, God is in control. Yes, God is the one who sets the finish to everything. And your job in the meantime is to both, to be in and not of. That is, to keep your identity while living in a society that rejects what you stand for. And that's, again, the message of Daniel chapter 6. It pleased Darius to set up over the kingdom 120 satraps. This is Daniel 6:1, stationed throughout the whole kingdom, and over them 3 presidents, including Daniel. To these satraps gave account, so that the king might suffer no loss. Soon Daniel distinguished himself above all the other presidents and satraps because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king planned to appoint him over the whole kingdom. So the presidents and the satraps tried to find grounds for complaints against Daniel in connection with the kingdom, but they could find no grounds for complaint or any corruption because he was faithful, and no negligence or corruption could be found in him. The men said, "We shall not find any ground for complaint against this Daniel unless we find it in connection with the law of his God." So that's chapter 6. Notice here now, Daniel, crisis after crisis. Again, he's really in the same sort of a situation where somebody wants him to give up who he is. And of course, it's making it clear that Daniel, who is following the chronology of the story, would be probably in the neighborhood of 80 years old. He's still there. He's still doing the work. He's still being blessed. And the who is in charge is still to be questioned. In this case, in the person of Daniel, who is the one who represents God amongst the people here. He presents such a perfect case that the people who don't appreciate that have to come and destroy him. So the presidents, the satraps, conspired and came to the king and said to him, "O King Darius, live forever. All the presidents of the kingdom," except that, of course, not including Daniel. One sometimes has to wonder whether these kings had any brain cells functioning when they were being flattered. Because, "O king, live forever, all the presidents," whatever, and you say, except that there were 3 presidents, and we know at least one isn't here making this statement. The counselors and the governors are agreed that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an interdict that whoever prays to anyone divine or human for 30 days except to you, O king, shall be thrown into a den of lions. Now, O king, establish the interdict, sign the document, so that it cannot be changed according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be revoked. Therefore, King Darius signed the document, the interdict. Okay. King Darius is a historical issue, but as I've been pointing out, the historical issues here are not the main point, no matter where you're putting it. It's that we're telling a story, and the issue here is that this comes before the reign of Cyrus. Cyrus is the conqueror of Babylon. Belshazzar has been kicked out. So who is this Darius? We have Darius the Mede, and there's been all kinds of historical arguments about whether this is possible. In the interpretation that puts all of this ending at the in the 2nd century, that is applying it to the time of the Maccabees, Babylon is succeeded by Media, which is succeeded by Persia. History doesn't tell us anything about this, but that is the kind of a picture that is being presented. Again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the history here. We'll see it again when we go to the 4 beasts, and we went over it in some detail when I was discussing chapter 2. So anyway, here we are with this Darius. We don't care who he is, except that he is the king who is not accepting that God is sovereign. Now, he's doing it because he's been flattered. Wow, isn't it nice? Let's have everybody pray only to me for the next 30 days. Yay me, I would be wondering whether I wouldn't be in trouble because of my inability to answer any of these prayers. But flattery, apparently, in the court of the king will get you everywhere. Daniel 6, verse 10. Daniel knew that the document had been signed. Although he knew it had been signed, he continued to go to his house, which had windows in its upper room open toward Jerusalem, and to get down on his knees 3 times a day to pray to his God and praise him, just as he had done previously. The conspirators came and found Daniel praying and seeking mercy before his God. Then they approached the king and said concerning the interdict, O king, did you not sign an interdict that anyone who prays to anyone, divine or human, within 30 days except you, O king, shall be thrown into a den of lions? And the king, having better memory than judgment, says, the thing stands fast according to the laws of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be revoked. By the way, law of the Medes and Persians is a bit of an expression in the language, although I found that less and less other people know what I'm talking about if I refer to something as the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be revoked. Then they responded to the king, Daniel, one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king. And isn't it a sad thing when the king doesn't have attention being paid to him? Or to the interdict you have signed, but he is saying his prayers 3 times a day. And the interesting thing here is that it brings up 2 things, and as I have tried to talk about how we understand ourselves as Christians, I bring this up. There's the 2 elements. I referred to in and not out of, but also identity, and at the same time as identity, witness. Sometimes the things that you do for witness are not the same as the things you do for identity. Now, Daniel has established identity. He's refused to eat the king's food. That would be, 50, 60 years in the past. And his 3 friends followed this up by refusing to bow down to the image. There's identity there. What's going on here is both identity, which he's praying. Now, he could say to himself, if I close the window, I can face Jerusalem and I can pray, and it's just me. So there's nothing here that I have to do, but he keeps the window open and lets himself be caught doing what he believes that he should do. 2 things. He's not going beyond. He is not doing less than he did before the king's decree. That means that he's keeping his identity, he's keeping his witness, but he's not going out of his way to be extraordinarily obnoxious. A couple of points that one would make here. If Daniel was always known to pray, if he always did this before his window and he stopped because of the king's decree, then he is going to say, the king's word in this is more important to me than God. If he closes the window, he can still pray, he can still praise, but his witness is then cut off. We do this a little bit sometimes with public prayers. I personally draw the line a little bit, how shall I say, further out than some people do. Praying in public. I prefer not to see prayers happen in public events where not everybody is in the one case. It makes me feel almost like we have gone on to the other side of the book of Daniel, where we are saying to everybody, bow down and worship the way that we do. In other words, that we then as Christians are calling upon everybody to bow down. Such worship is not advantageous in my view. It is not, I think by scriptural standards, true worship. Daniel here does not try to force anybody else to. He remains who he is. His integrity is as who he is. One of the commentators I was reading in Desmond Ford's book, this little one here, which is out of print, but there's still some used copies available in various places, comments that there have been commentators saying that Daniel becomes a sort of a Christ figure, which is essentially what I would say about the primary nature of the death of Christ. We have the constant question, why did Jesus have to die? There are many metaphors, there are many ways of talking about the atonement, there are many ways of talking about the sacrifice of Jesus, the death of Jesus, and I think that almost everyone that I've ever heard has something to contribute. But there's a fundamental point. If Jesus, God incarnate, as it says in John 1:14, that he's living in, he's tenting, he's camping amongst us. If he doesn't stay through death, then it's not a real incarnation. You know, you cannot experience humanity without also experiencing both the fear of and the reality of death, because that is something that we all must experience. It is part of being human. Secondly, though, if you are a person who lives a life of integrity amongst people whose integrity is at best questionable, you're going to find yourself in some trouble. Jesus was who he was, and simply by being who he was, he threatened the power base of other people. And as a result, we have the crucifixion. Now, do we also want to see that as a sacrifice, as dying for us? I absolutely want to see that. But at the foundation, the death of Jesus is what makes the incarnation of Jesus real, because he went the whole course. He did the whole thing. And Daniel, in essence, is doing the same thing. He lives here in integrity. His integrity is a challenge to those who don't want to live that way. You look at this person, he is doing too well. He is going to be promoted. He's going to be more powerful. And so we have to get rid of him. There's an offense in doing what is right. And we really have to watch out, because we often talk about the gospel offending. We talk about good living offending people. But very often what's really offending people is the way we rub their noses in it. And so you have to watch out that if you are causing offense, you are causing offense by simply doing the right thing. That if people are offended when you do the right thing, that's one thing. If you go out and do the right thing in such a way as to cause offense, that's going to be something else. Daniel doesn't go out there and make the problem. Daniel just is who he is. He lives his identity. And what he doesn't allow is he doesn't allow the circumstances, he doesn't allow the actions of the people around him to change that identity. So he goes out there, he prayed 3 times a day before, he prays 3 times a day afterward, because God is the only one who is due worship and praise. And now we get back to the poor king, who's often like, he's a good symbol of those, really the majority of people. In a way, I think the officials who work with Daniel, represent kind of a minority, whereas the king represents most people who are kind of pushed around by the ideas that other people put out there. Unlike Daniel, they haven't decided on their identity. They haven't chosen a course, and they do not have the integrity to stick with it, so they can just be pushed around. And that's the nature of this king. Because as we see in verse 14, the king heard the charge. He was very much distressed. Why is the king distressed? He knows that Daniel is a person of integrity. He knows that he worships the God of heaven. And now he's sitting here going, Daniel was Daniel. I was me, and I made a law that was really stupid, and Daniel was Daniel, and he didn't obey it. And I'm stuck. And that's really what happens to a lot of people. They're pushed back and forth. If you don't have this identity like Daniel has established, Daniel has established his identity. If you don't have that, you're going to get pushed around by whatever kind of flattering words people can use. And so one of those key elements to, I think, righteous living, to good living as Christians, in this case, good living as Jews, is simply making the choice. As it said in the beginning, Daniel purposed in his heart. And here in chapter 6, it doesn't say that, but it's extended. Daniel purposed in his heart to be Daniel. He was going to be Daniel, the worshiper of the true God. He was not being pushed around. And here's the king. He's the other side of the picture. The king is like, oh, king, live forever. Aren't you great? Aren't you wonderful? Wouldn't it be nice if everybody prayed only to you for 30 days? No thinking, sure. Then, as happened to the king, will happen to us. The king was much distressed. That's what results from being in that, in the nature of the king. The king may be singular here, but I think he's representing the vast majority of the world, who is just lives to be dragged around by people who bring the right words to make them feel good, to make them decide this is a good way, this is going to make us better, without consideration as to whether those words back up or call for good actions, which will actually have good results. There is the king. He's distressed. He's determined to save Daniel until the sun went down. He made every effort to rescue him. But you'll notice, of course, that these efforts are completely fruitless. We're not told what they are, but there's hardly anything that they could be. He has a set of laws. He's already taken a set of actions. He's been led around by the nose, and he's stuck. So the conspirators come to the king, knowing they've got him in a corner, and say, look, we're law-abiding people. Notice they don't say, yay, we've won, we're going to kill the bad guy, we're going to kill the guy we don't like. It's, hey, it's the law. You ever heard that? It's the law, so we've got to stick with it. So here the law says, kill Daniel. Know, O king, that it is the law of the Medes and Persians that no interdict or ordinance that the king establishes can be changed. Run into that in Esther as well. The king in Esther, or rather Esther, is a little more creative about working around it. Then the king gave the command, and Daniel was thrown into the den of lions. The king said to Daniel, may your God, whom you faithfully serve, deliver you. A stone was brought, laid on the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet, with the signet of his lord, so that nothing might be changed concerning Daniel. Then the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting. No food was brought to him, and sleep fled from him. And I can't help but say that he pretty much deserved the lot of it. So Daniel is in the lion's den. The king is outside fasting and not sleeping because he really loves Daniel, but he's been led around by the nose, and the result has been that there's Daniel in the lion's den. So there we are. Daniel, then, I like the little heading here in my Bible. Maybe I won't read the whole thing. Daniel saved from the lions. Now, we all know this is one of the stories of Daniel that is most commonly told is probably Daniel in the lion's den, I would say, followed by Belshazzar's feast in just that little bit of the handwriting on the wall. So the king comes down. I'm going to summarize this little bit. A break of day calls out to Daniel, O Daniel, servant of the living God. If you knew that, why is Daniel in the lion's den? See, that's the problem. If you haven't chosen the course, a course is going to be set for you. That goes in life, that goes in politics, that goes in religion, goes in ethics, whatever. If you don't choose your course, it's going to get set for you. So he says, has your God delivered you? Daniel says, O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths so that they would not hurt me, because I was found blameless before him and also before you, O king. I have done no wrong. Then the king was exceedingly glad and commanded that Daniel be taken up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den. I apologize. I'm probably going to sneeze again here before we're done. King gave a command, and those who had accused Daniel were brought and thrown into the den of lions, they, their children, and their wives. Before they reached the bottom of the den, the lions overpowered them and broke all their bones in pieces. And then, as has happened in several chapters before, we have this whole confession of the living God, because of the fact that God has demonstrated on behalf of his faithful servant what it is that is coming up. And if you will give me just a moment here, I'm going to proceed into chapter 7. Okay, and now back into Daniel chapter 7. Daniel chapter 6 ends this division of the stories. And as I've mentioned, I think the problem here is that we do tend to see the stories as separate, but the stories are telling exactly the same thing. They're saying that difficulty follows difficulty, problem follows problem, but God is the one who is eventually in control and is going to finish things up. Now, we're going to see some differences between this and the eschatology of Paul when I talk to Dr. Weiss about it, but we'll see some of these time concepts going into the way that Christians understand eschatology. For example, the amillennial view, which says essentially that the church continues to grow and eventually God's people triumph to where everyone says Jesus is Lord. And Jesus does return in glory, but not to reverse the state of affairs that is already existing. Apocalyptic tends to talk about the end of the particular situation as a cataclysmic response by God. And that's what we're going to see here. There's the key intervention in the stories. Now, in the visions, we see that as the story of the individual goes, so does the story of the world go. If we look here at Daniel chapter 7, and I'm looking at the time, we're not going to get anywhere near done. So I just want to look first at how this starts up. And then I'm going to turn briefly to the Psalms. In the first year of King Belshazzar of Babylon, Daniel had a dream and visions of his head as he lay in bed. Then he wrote down the dream. I, Daniel, saw in my vision by night the four winds of heaven stirring up the great sea, and four great beasts came up out of the sea, different from one another. First was like a lion and had eagle's wings. Then as I watched, its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a human being. And a human mind was given to it. Another beast appeared, a second one that looked like a bear. It was raised up on one side and had 3 tusks in its mouth among its teeth, and was told, arise, devour many bodies. After this I watched, another appeared like a leopard. The beast had 4 wings of a bird on its back, and 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. After this I saw in the visions by night, and a fourth beast, terrifying and dreadful and exceedingly strong. It had great iron teeth and was devouring, breaking in pieces, and stamping what was left with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that preceded it, and it had 10 horns. I was considering the horns when another horn appeared, a little one coming up among them to make room for it. 3 of the earlier horns were plucked up by the roots. There were eyes like human eyes on this horn, and a mouth speaking arrogantly. So I read that kind of in succession so that we get the picture. You stand on the sea, as he says. There's this the winds are stirring the great sea, and then he sees a series of beasts come up out of the sea. Now, what this should do for us is give us a quick push back toward Genesis chapter 1. I'm actually turning to the Psalms, but I'm going to talk about Genesis 1 for a minute, because if you go in Genesis 1:2, now treating Genesis 1:1 as kind of an intro, in the beginning, God created, or when God began to create. I'm not going to go into the translation issue there, but one or the other that introduces the idea of creation. And then we start with the water and the winds, the Ruach, the Spirit of God, the wind of God is moving over the waters. And so here you have this sea, you have the winds over the waters, and the beasts coming up out of the waters. And so we're starting here from the imagery of creation, but this is not specifically a creation scene. The imagery of creation is that you have the territory of God's control in the middle, and outside you have the sea of chaos, dividing the waters from the land. So you have symbolism going on here of the part that is under the control of evil to whatever extent. And you're also, though, at the same time going to see as we go through the vision that evil has its limits. But nonetheless, you have these are invaders of God's world. These are invaders of God's people. It is possible, although I don't think probable, that even the land here may be talking about the land of Israel, where God's people live. Now, this, let me get to the right place. Psalm chapter 74, and I'd recommend reading the whole thing. They're talking here about it. It starts out, "Oh God, why do you cast us off forever?" Now you notice a lot of the Psalms are apocalyptic in the sense that they are crisis prayers. They're prayers in a situation of great disaster. Why are you angry? Going into verse 4, Psalm 74, "Your foes have roared within your holy place. They set up their emblems there. The upper entrance they hacked, the wooden walls with axes, and then with hatchets and hammers they smashed all its carved work. They set your sanctuary on fire. They desecrated the dwelling place of your name, bringing it to the ground. They said to themselves, 'We will utterly subdue them.' They burned all the meeting places of God in the land." Now, depending on how you interpret meeting places, this is a psalm that could talk about the exile in the 6th century, or probably even better, talk about the time of the Maccabees, when there are not only the temple, which is being destroyed, but there are synagogues all around through the land, the meeting places that are destroyed. So we have this crisis situation. Now look at what's invoked here. Verse 12, because again, there's more of why do you hold back, but verse 12, "Yet God my King is from of old, working salvation in the earth. You divided the sea by your might. You broke the heads of the dragons in the waters." Now this divided the sea by your might, don't go just back to the Exodus, although dividing the sea is tremendously symbolic. But go right back to creation, where you divide the sea and from the land, and that's the defeat. Now, there's a great deal of other imagery that comes from creation stories around the dragon. You're dividing a great dragon. You kill the sea monsters. And a lot of that imagery comes in the Psalms. But you have to remember that this imagery is available in the poetry and the songs, and probably in many things that we don't have. Verse 14, Psalm 74, "You crushed the heads of Leviathan. You gave him his food for the creatures of the wilderness. You cut openings for springs and torrents. You dried up every flowing stream. Yours is the days, yours is the night. You fixed all the bounds of the earth," and that bounds is important. And so here in Psalm 74 in the prayer, pointing out how God is the creator, God is the one who is actually in control. He has put everything in bounds, so it's time for you to fix all of it. Now in Daniel 7, you have all of these creatures are violating the bounds. 4 creatures in a row violate the bounds. They come from the chaos of the sea and onto the land. We're going to have to leave it right there. I'll pick it up next week as we go on through Daniel chapter 7 and talk a little bit about the various beasts and what they represent, and also how they tie in with chapter 2 and with the dating of the chapter. In the meantime, thanks for being with me tonight, and I'll see you next week.